The diplomatic reception aboard Harmony Point buzzed with the controlled chaos of 100 different species attempting polite conversation while mentally calculating trade advantages. Empress Narita Valeth stood at the massive viewport, her reflection a ghostly overlay against the star field beyond. The ceremonial armor of her rank, midnight blue with silver threading that caught the station's artificial light, marked her as clearly as a target beacon. She had conquered 12 star systems before her 30th birthday, and her reputation preceded her into every room like a cold wind. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, who commanded fleets capable of glassing planets, was here playing at diplomacy. But the Valdorian Empire needed these trade routes, and even empresses occasionally had to smile and pretend they cared about commerce regulations. "Your Imperial Majesty," her aide whispered at her elbow, "the Centauri delegation is requesting a private audience." Narita nodded without turning from the viewport. 3 more hours of this charade, then she could return to her flagship and the comfortable certainty of military command. No pretense, no careful words chosen to avoid offense, just clear orders and immediate compliance. The sound of something crashing interrupted her thoughts, followed by a very human curse that somehow managed to be both apologetic and creative. She turned to see a man in engineering coveralls standing amid the wreckage of what had been an elaborate ice sculpture, his face a study in mortified embarrassment. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "that's definitely going in my permanent record." The reception had gone silent, all eyes on the human who had just destroyed what was apparently a priceless artistic tribute to interspecies cooperation. Narita watched with fascination as he knelt among the ice fragments, carefully gathering pieces as if he might somehow reconstruct the sculpture through sheer determination. "I don't suppose anyone has a really good glue," he asked the assembled crowd, his tone so genuinely hopeful that Narita felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been frozen solid for longer than she cared to remember. "Imperial ice sculptures," she said, moving toward him with measured steps, "are traditionally considered irreplaceable." The human looked up at her, and she was struck by the complete absence of fear in his expression. Brown eyes, she noted, warm and intelligent, with laugh lines that suggested he smiled more often than circumstances probably warranted. "Well, that's unfortunate," he said, rising to his feet with ice chips still clinging to his coveralls. "I don't suppose there's a statute of limitations on artistic destruction. Maybe some kind of diplomatic immunity for extreme clumsiness. Are you attempting to negotiate with me?" Narita asked, genuinely curious. In her experience, humans who found themselves in her presence either groveled or postured. This one was doing neither. "I'm attempting to avoid an interstellar incident," he replied, then seemed to realize who he was speaking to. "Your Empress Narita Valeth. The conqueror of Arcturus. The Iron Crown of the Outer Rim. I am." She waited for the fear to set in, for him to remember that she could have him executed with a word. Instead, he smiled. "I'm Marcus Chen, and I just destroyed your ice sculpture. I'd say it's nice to meet you, but the circumstances are somewhat less than ideal." The reception remained frozen around them, diplomatic conversation suspended as everyone waited to see how the Empress would respond to such casual irreverence. Narita found herself studying Marcus's face, noting the way his smile reached his eyes, the complete lack of artifice in his expression. "The sculpture," she said slowly, "was a gift from the Altarian Council. It represented the tears of their moon goddess, carved from ice that never melts." Marcus's face fell. "Oh. Oh, that's significantly worse than I thought. Is there a traditional punishment for destroying the tears of a moon goddess? Please tell me it doesn't involve actual tears." Despite herself, Narita felt her lips twitch. "The traditional punishment is death by spacing." "Spacing," Marcus repeated thoughtfully. "That's the one where they throw you out an airlock, right? Not the one where they make you organize really large closets." The sound that escaped Narita's throat might have been a laugh. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed at anything that wasn't the defeat of an enemy. The former. Right. Well, in that case, would you accept an apology and maybe dinner as an alternative? I make excellent pasta, and I promise not to destroy any more priceless artifacts while cooking. The silence in the reception hall was deafening. Narita was aware of every eye upon them, every diplomatic ear straining to hear her response. Protocol demanded that she have this human removed, possibly arrested for destruction of diplomatic property. Her reputation required a show of strength, a reminder that empresses were not to be trifled with. Instead, she found herself considering his offer with genuine interest. When was the last time someone had offered to cook for her? When was the last time anyone had treated her as simply a person rather than a title? "You're either very brave or very foolish," she said finally. "Historically, I've been told there's not much difference," Marcus replied. "So, dinner? I know a little place in the civilian sector that makes amazing coffee. And I promise to keep my hands away from anything that looks valuable and/or religious." Narita looked around the reception hall, taking in the shocked faces of diplomats and dignitaries who had never seen their empress engage in anything resembling casual conversation. She thought of the 3 hours of formal negotiations still ahead of her, the careful political dancing that would accomplish little beyond maintaining the status quo. 1 hour, she heard herself saying. After the evening session concludes. Marcus's smile was like sunrise over a conquered world, brilliant, unexpected, and somehow transformative. Deck 7, Section C, look for the place that smells like real food instead of recycled air and industrial lubricant. As he walked away, still picking ice chips from his coveralls, Narita realized that something fundamental had shifted in her universe. For the first time in her adult life, she was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with military strategy or political advantage. The reception gradually resumed around her, conversations picking up where they had left off, but Narita barely noticed. She was thinking about brown eyes and easy smiles, about someone who had looked at the most feared woman in known space and offered to cook her dinner. Her aide appeared at her elbow again, expression carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, the Centauri delegation is still waiting." "Let them wait," Narita said, surprising herself with the words. "Some things are more important than trade negotiations." She spent the rest of the reception in a strange state of anticipation, mechanically performing her diplomatic duties while her thoughts kept drifting to a human engineer who had accidentally destroyed a moon goddess's tears and somehow, in the process, begun to thaw something in her own frozen heart. The Empress who had conquered star systems found herself conquered by something far more dangerous than any military force, curiosity about what lay beyond the careful walls she had built around herself. And for the first time in decades, Narita Valeth was eager to discover what she might find on the other side. The negotiations had been proceeding for 3 days, and they were going nowhere fast. Valeria sat at the polished obsidian table in the formal conference room, her expression carved from stone as Ambassador Thorn presented yet another counter-proposal that would leave humanity with a bare fraction of their former territory. Around her, the obsidian delegation maintained their characteristic silence, waiting for her word to either accept or reject the human's latest desperate gambit. She should have been focused entirely on the political maneuvering, on extracting maximum concessions while appearing magnanimous. Instead, she found her attention drifting to the atmospheric recycling vents, wondering if Marcus Webb was somewhere in the station's bowels, maintaining the systems that kept them all breathing. "Your Imperial Majesty." Ambassador Thorn's voice cut through her distraction. "We await your response to our proposal." Valeria's gaze snapped back to the present. The humans were offering to cede 17 star systems in exchange for guaranteed autonomy over their core worlds. It was a reasonable offer, more reasonable than anything she had expected from a species facing extinction. Under normal circumstances, she would have accepted immediately and begun planning the integration of human worlds into the Obsidian Empire. But these were not normal circumstances. "The proposal has merit," she said carefully. "However, the Empire requires time to consider the implications of such an arrangement. We will reconvene tomorrow." General Kane shot her a sharp look. In the 3 years since the war began, Valeria had never requested additional time to consider a human surrender. Her reputation was built on swift, decisive action. But she ignored his unspoken question and rose from the table with imperial dignity. "Tomorrow, then," Ambassador Thorn said, inclining his head respectfully. We appreciate your consideration, Your Imperial Majesty. As the delegations filed out of the conference room, Valeria caught sight of a familiar figure in maintenance coveralls passing by the transparent aluminum windows. Marcus Webb, carrying what appeared to be a hydroponics nutrient tray, paused to examine something on his handheld scanner. Even from a distance, she could see the concentration on his face, the way he approached even mundane tasks with complete focus. She had been thinking about him far too much. Majesty, General Kane fell into step beside her as they walked toward the obsidian quarters. If I may speak freely. You may. The human proposal is more generous than anticipated. In previous conflicts, species facing extinction have offered far less favorable terms. Perhaps we should consider accepting before they realize their mistake. Valeria nodded absently. Perhaps. What is your assessment of their negotiating position? Desperate but not defeated. They're buying time, though I cannot determine for what purpose. Their military situation hasn't improved, and they have no significant allies. Kane paused. Unless they're hoping to wear down our patience. An interesting theory. Valeria stopped at the junction that led to her private quarters. General, I require a comprehensive briefing on the station's technical specifications. Defensive systems, life support, emergency protocols. Kane's expression grew puzzled. Majesty? Is there a security concern? Call it due diligence. I want to understand every aspect of our temporary home. She fixed him with a steady look. And I want that briefing in 6 hours. That should give you sufficient time to gather the necessary information. Of course, Majesty. 6 hours. Valeria waited until Kane had disappeared around the corner before changing direction. Instead of heading to her quarters, she made her way toward the service levels, following the route she had memorized 3 days ago. The corridors here were narrower, more utilitarian, filled with the constant hum of machinery that kept the station functioning. She found Marcus in Hydroponics Bay 7, tending to what appeared to be a small experimental garden. He was kneeling beside a row of flowering plants, carefully adjusting their nutrient feeds with the same precision she had seen him apply to the coolant system repairs. Those are beautiful, she said from the doorway. Marcus looked up, startled, then smiled when he recognized her. Valeria. I was wondering if I'd see you again. You were expecting me? Hoping, maybe. Marcus stood, brushing soil from his hands. And you're out of uniform again. Valeria looked down at herself. She had chosen civilian clothing for this expedition, a simple gray tunic and trousers that allowed her to move freely through the station without attracting attention. Imperial armor is not well suited for hydroponics bays. No, I imagine not. Marcus gestured at the plants. These are earth roses. I've been trying to adapt them to the station's atmospheric conditions. They're finicky. Valeria moved closer, studying the delicate blooms. They were unlike anything in the Obsidian Empire, soft, organic, beautiful without serving any apparent functional purpose. Why? Why what? Why grow them at all? They serve no practical purpose, consume resources, require constant maintenance. She touched one of the petals gently, surprised by its softness. In the Empire, such things would be considered wasteful. Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching her examine the flowers. Because beauty matters, he said finally. Because making something lovely is worth doing even if it doesn't have a practical purpose. Because. He hesitated, then met her eyes. Because sometimes the most important things are the ones that exist just to make life better, not more efficient. Valeria felt something stir in her chest, the same unfamiliar sensation she had experienced during their first meeting. The Empire would consider that philosophy dangerous. Would you? The question hung in the air between them. Valeria found herself studying Marcus's face, noting the way his eyes reflected genuine curiosity rather than fear or calculation. When was the last time someone had asked her what she personally believed, rather than what the Empire demanded? I am not certain, she admitted. Such concepts are foreign to my experience. What's your experience been like? Marcus asked gently. Growing up in the Empire, I mean. Valeria hesitated. She had never spoken of her childhood to anyone outside the inner circle of Imperial advisors. But something about the quiet garden, the soft light filtering through the transparent aluminum dome, made her feel strangely safe. I became Empress at 16, she said quietly. My parents and siblings were assassinated by rebels who believed that eliminating the royal family would end the Empire's expansion. They were incorrect. Marcus's expression softened. I'm sorry. That must have been formative, Valeria finished. I learned that weakness invites destruction, that mercy is often mistaken for vulnerability, that the universe respects only strength. She touched another rose petal, marveling at its fragility. I have spent the last 9 years proving that lesson correct. And now? Now I find myself in a hydroponics bay, discussing the aesthetic value of flowers with someone who should fear me. Valeria looked up at him. It is disorienting. Marcus smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. Good disorienting or bad disorienting? I am still determining that. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the gentle hum of growing things. Valeria found herself oddly reluctant to leave this peaceful sanctuary, to return to the weight of imperial responsibility and the endless calculations of power. Marcus, she said suddenly. You mentioned terraforming. Show me. Show you what? Your work. The worlds you've helped create. She gestured at the garden around them. If you can make roses grow in artificial atmosphere, what can you do with an entire planet? Marcus's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Are you serious? You want to see the terraforming data? I want to understand the process. The philosophy behind it. Well, in that case. Marcus moved to a workstation at the far end of the bay, his fingers dancing across the holographic interface. Let me show you Kepler 438b. It's one of our most successful projects. The air above the workstation shimmered, then resolved into a three-dimensional image of a world. But this wasn't the barren rock that Valeria expected. Instead, she saw a planet painted in shades of blue and green and gold, with white clouds swirling through a breathable atmosphere. It started as a Mars-type world, Marcus explained, manipulating the display to show the planet's transformation over time. Thin atmosphere, no surface water, average temperature of -40 degrees Celsius. But it was the right distance from its star, and it had the basic materials we needed. Valeria watched, fascinated, as the hologram showed the gradual introduction of atmospheric processors, the melting of polar ice caps, the first tentative growths of modified vegetation. How long did this take? 47 years for the initial phase. Another 30 for the ecosystem to stabilize enough for colonization. Marcus zoomed in on a section of the planet's surface, showing cities that seemed to grow organically from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. Now it's home to 2 million people. 2 million, Valeria repeated. I have conquered worlds with larger populations in a single campaign. But you didn't create those populations, Marcus said gently. You took something that already existed. This. He gestured at the hologram. This is something entirely new. A world that went from lifeless rock to a thriving ecosystem because someone decided it was worth the effort. Valeria studied the image, trying to imagine the decades of patient work that had gone into such a transformation. In the Empire, projects were measured in months or years, not generations. The idea of investing nearly a century in creating something with no immediate strategic value was almost incomprehensible. The resources required, she said. The time, the expertise, the sheer commitment to something with such uncertain outcomes. That's what makes it worthwhile, Marcus said. Anyone can destroy a world in a few hours. Creating one takes everything you have. And if it fails? If the ecosystem collapses, if the colonists die, if the investment produces nothing but empty wasteland? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then you try again. Somewhere else, with better techniques, with more knowledge. Failure is just another kind of data. Valeria turned to stare at him. You would accept such losses? The waste of resources, the destruction of human lives. I would accept the risk, Marcus corrected. Because the alternative is never trying at all. And that. He met her eyes. That's not really living, is it? It's just existing. The words hit her like a physical blow. Existing. Was that what she had been doing all these years? Managing an empire, conquering worlds, maintaining order through fear and force. When had she last created something new, built something beautiful, taken a risk for any reason other than strategic advantage? Your Imperial Majesty. A voice from the doorway interrupted her thoughts. General Kane stood at the entrance to the hydroponics bay, his expression carefully neutral. I have the technical briefing you requested. Valeria's blood ran cold. How long had he been standing there? How much had he heard? General. You're early. My apologies, Majesty. I wanted to ensure the information was complete. His gaze shifted to Marcus, who had stepped protectively closer to Valeria. I was not aware you were conducting inspections. I was examining the station's food production capabilities, Valeria said smoothly. Understanding our supply lines is essential for extended negotiations. Of course. Kane's tone suggested he didn't believe a word of it, but he was too well trained to voice his suspicions directly. Shall we discuss the briefing in your quarters? Yes. Valeria looked back at Marcus, who was watching the exchange with growing tension. Thank you for the educational tour, Mr. Webb. Anytime, Your Imperial Majesty, Marcus replied, but his voice was carefully formal now, all the warmth of their conversation locked away behind diplomatic courtesy. As Valeria followed Kane from the hydroponics bay, she found herself looking back at the garden, at the impossible roses and the holographic world that had been born from patience and hope rather than conquest and fear. She had spent her life taking worlds from other species, but she had never considered what it might mean to give a world life. The thought followed her back to her quarters, where General Kane spread out technical schematics and security protocols with methodical precision. She listened to his briefing with half her attention, nodding at appropriate intervals while her mind wandered to blue roses and the way Marcus's eyes had lit up when he spoke of creation. Majesty, Kane said suddenly. If I may speak plainly. You may. The human engineer. He could be useful for intelligence gathering, but personal involvement would be unwise. The Empire has strict policies regarding fraternization with enemy personnel. Valeria's expression went cold. Are you suggesting that I am personally involved with a human? I am suggesting that the human seems to have made an impression. And that such impressions, however innocent, could be used against you by those who would question your commitment to imperial objectives. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Kane was not merely her advisor, he was also her watcher, the eyes and ears of the imperial court. If he reported back that she had been compromised by human sentiment, there would be consequences far beyond her personal feelings. Your concern is noted, General, she said icily. But I assure you that my commitment to the Empire remains absolute. Of course, Majesty. I meant no offense. But as Kane gathered his materials and left her quarters, Valeria found herself staring out at the stars and wondering what it might cost to be absolute in her commitment to something other than conquest. The next morning brought a new session of negotiations, but Valeria found it difficult to focus on territorial concessions and trade agreements. Every time Ambassador Thorne spoke of human colonies, she found herself thinking of Kepler, 438b and the 77 years of patient work that had transformed dead rock into living world. When the session adjourned for lunch, she made a decision that would have horrified her advisors. She went looking for Marcus Webb. She found him in Engineering Section C, working on what appeared to be an atmospheric recycling unit. He was alone, his focus entirely absorbed by the delicate calibration work required to maintain optimal air quality throughout the station. "Hello, Marcus." He looked up, startled, then smiled. "Valeria. I wasn't sure I'd see you again after yesterday. Your General Kane seems protective." "He's concerned about Imperial interests," Valeria said carefully. "As am I." Marcus set down his tools and studied her face. "But you came back." "I came back." "Why?" Valeria hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Because I cannot stop thinking about your terraforming project. About the idea of creating worlds instead of conquering them." Marcus's expression grew serious. "It's not just about the worlds, Valeria. It's about the philosophy behind them. The idea that you can take something broken or empty and make it beautiful, make it alive, make it better than it was before. And you believe this philosophy could apply to other things?" "I believe it could apply to anything. Worlds, societies, people." Marcus took a step closer. "Even empires." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Valeria found herself studying his face, noting the way his expression combined hope and determination in equal measure. This human, this engineer who should have been cowering before her imperial might, was suggesting that she could transform the very foundation of everything she had built. "The Empire has existed for over 1,000 years, she said quietly. It has brought order to hundreds of worlds, unified dozens of species under a single banner. To suggest that it could be improved, is to suggest that centuries of tradition and sacrifice have been in error." "Not in error," Marcus said gently. "Just incomplete. Like a planet that has atmosphere and water but no life yet. The foundation is there, but imagine what it could become with the right kind of cultivation." Valeria felt something flutter in her chest, the same sensation she had experienced among the roses, but stronger now, more insistent. "You speak of cultivation as though it were simple. I speak of it as though it were worthwhile." Marcus reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. "Valeria, what if instead of conquering the remaining human worlds, we found a way to make them part of something larger? Something that honored both human creativity and obsidian order." The touch of his hand sent warmth shooting up her arm. No one had touched her without permission in years, and yet this felt natural, right, like coming home after a long journey through hostile territory. "The human worlds would never accept obsidian rule," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe they would accept obsidian partnership," Marcus suggested. "Maybe they would choose to be part of something that was bigger than either of our species alone. And you think I could create such a thing? I think you're the only one who could." Marcus's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "You have the power to end this war with a word. But you also have the power to end it with something better than surrender. Something that turns enemies into allies, conquest into cooperation." Valeria stared at him, her mind racing with possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. An empire built on partnership rather than dominance. Worlds that chose to join rather than being forced to submit. A legacy of creation rather than conquest. It was terrifying. It was impossible. It was everything she had never known she wanted. "Such a change would face enormous resistance," she said carefully. "From both sides. Humans who have lost loved ones to obsidian weapons would not easily forgive. Obsidians who have built their lives around imperial supremacy would not easily adapt. All the best terraforming projects face enormous resistance," Marcus said. "The atmosphere fights you, the soil rejects your plants, the weather systems try to return to their original patterns. But if you're patient, if you're persistent, if you're willing to adapt your methods when the first approach doesn't work, you can transform a dead world into a living one," Valeria finished. "Exactly." They stood in the humming engineering section, surrounded by the machinery that kept thousands of beings alive, and Valeria felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in her life, she was considering the possibility that there might be another way to be strong, another way to build a legacy that would outlast her own existence. I would need to know more, she said finally. About terraforming techniques, about partnership models, about the practical implementation of such radical concepts. Marcus's face lit up with hope. I could show you. Not just the theory, but the practice. There are techniques for soil rehabilitation, atmospheric adjustment, ecosystem balance, all of it could be adapted to social and political systems. When? Tonight? After the evening session? I could meet you in the hydroponics bay, it's private, and I have access to the full terraforming database there. Valeria nodded, her heart beating faster than it had in years. Tonight, then. As she made her way back to the diplomatic quarters, she passed General Kane in the corridor. He studied her face with sharp attention, and she wondered what he saw there. The Iron Empress, focused on imperial objectives? Or a woman who had just discovered that there might be more to existence than conquest and control? Majesty, he said, falling into step beside her. The afternoon session is scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. I am aware, General. And the human's proposal from yesterday? Valeria considered the question. 24 hours ago, she would have rejected any offer that left human worlds with meaningful autonomy. But now, walking through corridors filled with the products of human ingenuity and obsidian engineering working in harmony, she found herself wondering what might be possible if both species applied their strengths to building something new together. I am still considering the implications, she said finally. Of course, Majesty. But Kane's tone suggested that he was beginning to understand exactly what those implications might be. That evening, as she made her way to the hydroponics bay for the second time, Valeria reflected on the weight of the choice she was making. She was not merely meeting with an enemy engineer to discuss terraforming techniques. She was taking the first step toward a future that would require her to transform everything she had believed about power, about strength, about what it meant to be worthy of a crown. Marcus was waiting for her among the roses, his expression mixing nervousness and anticipation. You came, he said. I came, she confirmed. Now show me how to build a world. As the holographic displays came to life around them, showing the patient transformation of dead planets into thriving ecosystems, Valeria felt something she had never experienced before, hope for a future that was not built on the ruins of the past, but on the foundation of what could be created together. It was the most dangerous feeling she had ever allowed herself to have. And she found she didn't want to give it up. The emergency session convened at 0300 station time, when the artificial lighting dimmed to simulate night and most of the diplomatic staff should have been sleeping. Instead, the main conference hall buzzed with tension thick enough to cut with a plasma blade. Thessa Kane sat at the Zeltharian delegation's table, her fingers steepled as she watched the human representatives file in with expressions that ranged from grim determination to barely controlled fury. 48 hours. That's how long the peace talks had been stalled over a single paragraph in the territorial concessions clause. 48 hours of circular arguments, procedural delays, and increasingly heated exchanges that had brought them to the brink of complete breakdown. Outside the station, both fleets maintained their careful distances, but every intelligence report suggested they were positioning for renewed conflict. Thessa had been negotiating interspecies disputes for 15 years, long enough to recognize when talks were about to collapse spectacularly. The signs were all there, delegates arriving late, private conversations conducted in hushed whispers, the subtle shift from collaborative language to adversarial positioning. What frustrated her most was that the actual disagreement was relatively minor, a matter of mining rights on 3 uninhabited worlds that neither species particularly needed. But minor disagreements had started wars before. The Zeltharian Empire maintains its position, announced High Negotiator Vaxic, his voice carrying the formal tone that meant he was speaking for the historical record rather than actual communication. The contested systems have been under our administrative control for over 2 centuries. Human claims based on recent exploration cannot supersede established territorial sovereignty. Across the table, the human delegation's lead negotiator, a stern woman named Patricia Holbrook, responded with equal formality. The human coalition rejects the premise that prior occupation grants permanent territorial rights, particularly when such occupation was established without consultation with other spacefaring species. Our survey teams documented extensive mineral deposits that could benefit all galactic civilizations under proper stewardship. Thessa resisted the urge to massage her temples. They were arguing past each other, using diplomatic language to avoid addressing the real issue. Neither side trusted the other enough to make the concessions necessary for genuine peace. The Zeltharians feared that yielding any territory would be seen as weakness, encouraging human expansion into other contested regions. The humans worried that accepting Zeltharian territorial claims would legitimize their broader imperial ambitions. What they needed was a face-saving compromise that gave both sides something they could present as victory to their respective governments. Thessa had several ideas, but as a junior member of the Zeltharian delegation, her role was to observe and advise, not to make policy pronouncements. The session dragged on for 3 hours, covering the same ground repeatedly without progress. By the time the recess was called, Thessa felt like she had been listening to two groups of people determinedly talking past each other in different languages, despite the fact that the translation technology was working perfectly. She needed air. Or what passed for air in the station's carefully maintained atmosphere. The observation deck on level 5 was usually deserted during the artificial night cycle, which made it perfect for thinking without interruption. Thessa had discovered it 2 days into the negotiations, when the formal sessions had first started showing signs of strain. Tonight, however, she wasn't alone. A human man sat on one of the curved benches facing the viewport, his posture suggesting the same kind of frustration she was feeling. She recognized him from the negotiation sessions, Ryan Torres, one of the human delegation's junior mediators. Like her, he spent most of his time taking notes and whispering suggestions to more senior officials who seemed increasingly determined to ignore practical solutions in favor of political posturing. She should leave, find another place to think. Fraternizing with the opposition, even informally, could be seen as compromising her position. But something about his expression, the way he was staring out at the stars as if they might contain answers to problems that seemed increasingly unsolvable, made her pause. "Rough session," she said, settling onto a bench several feet away, close enough for conversation but far enough to maintain propriety. Ryan looked up, seemed surprised to see her, then nodded. "That's one way to put it. I was thinking more along the lines of diplomatic disaster waiting to happen." Despite herself, Thessa smiled. "I prefer challenging negotiation environment with significant obstacles to mutual understanding." "That's much more professional sounding," Ryan agreed. "Though I notice it means exactly the same thing." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the distant lights of both fleets maintaining their careful standoff. Up close, Ryan Torres was more attractive than she had noticed during the formal sessions. He had the kind of face that suggested intelligence and humor, with dark eyes that seemed genuinely interested in whatever he was looking at. His hair was slightly messed up, as if he had been running his hands through it, a habit she recognized from her own stress responses. "Can I ask you something?" Ryan said suddenly. As one frustrated junior diplomat to another. "You may ask," Thessa replied, unconsciously echoing the formal language patterns of her training. "Though I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough. Do you actually think your delegation wants this negotiation to succeed?" The question was dangerously direct, the kind that could be considered espionage if reported to the wrong people. Thessa found herself considering not just the question but why he felt comfortable asking it. "Define success," she said carefully. Ryan turned to face her more directly. "An agreement that both sides can live with. Something that stops the shooting without requiring either of our species to surrender their core interests." It was a good definition, Thessa realized. Clean, practical, focused on outcomes rather than process. By that definition? Yes, I believe most of our delegation genuinely want success. But I also think some of them are more afraid of being seen as weak than they are motivated by achieving peace. That's remarkably honest. You ask for honesty. Thessa studied his expression. What about your delegation? Ryan was quiet for a long moment. I think we want peace. But I also think we're terrified that any compromise will be seen as capitulation by the folks back home who are still angry about the colony raids 3 years ago. There it was, the real problem neither side wanted to acknowledge publicly. Both species were negotiating not just with each other but with their own domestic political pressures. Zeltharian expansion had been driven by economic necessity and cultural momentum for so long that any halt could be seen as the beginning of imperial decline. Human resistance had been fueled by righteous anger at territorial incursion, making compromise look like betrayal of those who had died defending their worlds. So we're stuck, Thessa said. Looks that way. Ryan paused, then added, unless someone finds a way to reframe the entire discussion. Thessa felt a spark of interest. During the formal sessions, Ryan Torres had struck her as competent but unremarkable, the kind of junior diplomat who took good notes and asked clarifying questions but rarely contributed original ideas. But there was something in his tone now that suggested deeper thinking. What kind of reframing? She asked. Ryan stood up and began pacing, the way people did when an idea was taking shape. What if we stopped arguing about who gets what territory and started talking about what we could accomplish together? Joint development agreements have been proposed, Thessa pointed out. Your senior negotiators rejected them as potentially compromising human sovereignty. Not joint development. Joint exploration. Ryan's pace quickened. Look, both our species are expanding outward, right? We're going to run into other spacefaring civilizations eventually. Some of them might be friendly, some might not. What if instead of fighting each other over territory we've already mapped, we agreed to coordinate our expansion into unexplored regions? Thessa felt her pulse quicken as she began to see the possibilities. Mutual defense agreements for new colonies. Shared exploration costs. Coordinated first contact protocols. Exactly. And here's the beautiful part, it doesn't require anyone to give up anything they already have. The contested systems become less important because both sides are focused on the bigger picture. It was elegant. More than that, it was the kind of solution that could be presented as visionary leadership rather than compromise born of weakness. Thessa found herself standing as well, her mind racing through the implications. There would be challenges, she said, but her tone suggested she was working through problems rather than dismissing the idea. Command structure for joint missions. Resource allocation. What happens if we encounter hostile species? All solvable problems, Ryan said, his excitement growing. The point is, we'd be solving them together instead of preparing to fight each other. They were standing close now, both caught up in the momentum of a genuinely new approach to problems that had seemed intractable just minutes before. Thessa could smell Ryan's aftershave, something subtle and clean that was entirely different from Zeltharian grooming products but pleasant in its own way. This could work, she said quietly. It could actually work. It could, Ryan agreed, and suddenly they were looking at each other rather than discussing policy implications. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility that had nothing to do with interstellar diplomacy. Thessa was suddenly very aware that they were alone on the observation deck, that Ryan Torres had kind eyes and an attractive smile, and that somewhere during their conversation she had started thinking of him as Ryan rather than the human mediator. We should. She began. Present this to our delegations, Ryan finished, but he didn't step away. Yes. Though it would be better if the idea came from senior negotiators rather than junior staff. Agreed. But first we'd need to work out the details. Make sure we're presenting a complete proposal rather than just a concept. It was a reasonable suggestion. Practical, even. The fact that it would require them to spend more time together developing the framework was simply a necessary aspect of thorough preparation. When? Thessa asked. Tomorrow night. Same time, after the formal sessions end? She should say no. Should suggest they work separately and compare notes through official channels. Should maintain the professional distance that had served her well throughout her diplomatic career. Yes, she said instead. I'll bring some preliminary analysis of the territorial law implications. And I'll work on the command structure challenges. Ryan's smile was warm and genuine. Thessa, I think we might actually be onto something here. The use of her first name sent an unexpected thrill through her chest. I hope so, Ryan. I really hope so. As she made her way back to her quarters, Thessa tried to convince herself that her racing pulse was simply excitement about finding a potential solution to the negotiation deadlock. The fact that Ryan Torres was attractive and intelligent and had looked at her with something that might have been admiration was entirely incidental to her professional interest in their joint project. Entirely incidental, she repeated to herself as she began drafting preliminary notes on joint exploration frameworks, trying to ignore the way her heart skipped whenever she thought about their meeting tomorrow night. The war between their peoples hung in the balance, but as Thessa worked late into the artificial night, she began to suspect that the most dangerous negotiations were just beginning,